Welcome to Fluent Daily, the English listening channel for advanced learners at B2 and C1 level. Every episode features a rich, flowing conversation in natural English on a topic that is genuinely worth thinking about: history, psychology, science, philosophy, and more. There are no simplified sentences here, no slow speech, no vocabulary drills. Just real English spoken naturally on ideas that matter. This is Fluent Daily. Let's get into it.
Today we have a great story, so let's get started right now. Imagine you're sitting in a room with the absolute smartest military and political minds on the planet. I mean, you are surrounded by Ivy League graduates, seasoned generals, brilliant strategists.
Right, the absolute best of the best.
Exactly. You have all the data, you have all the expertise, and you basically have the combined IQ of like a small university department. And yet together, you make a decision so incomprehensibly stupid, so detached from reality, that it nearly starts World War III.
Yeah, it's a terrifying scenario.
Right. So why does this happen? Because you, like almost everyone else, walked into that room believing a massive, invisible illusion. You assumed that a group of geniuses would naturally combine to form an even bigger genius.
Which, logically, you'd think is how it works.
You would, but human chemistry just doesn't work that way. Sometimes you combine a room full of geniuses and the chemical reaction produces an idiot.
Welcome to today's deep dive, by the way. I'm your host, and we are going to completely dismantle this illusion today. Thanks for having me. And yeah, I'd say it is arguably the most dangerous blind spot we have as a species. We carry around this grand delusion that the individual is the fundamental, unchanging unit of psychology.
Like we're just fixed objects.
Exactly. We assume that your thoughts, your morals, your risk tolerance are basically a fixed constant. You think that when you walk into a crowded room, you are still just you. Right. Your solo personality is simply transported into a shared space.
Yeah, that's exactly how I always pictured it. I used to think of a group of people like a bowl of fruit.
A bowl of fruit.
Yeah, stay with me. You have an apple, an orange, a banana, all just sitting next to each other in the bowl. If you take the apple out, it's still the exact same apple. It hasn't changed its molecular structure just because it was sitting next to a banana.
I see where you're going with this.
But what we're diving into today, looking at all our sources, is that human group dynamics are not a fruit bowl. They're a volatile chemical reaction. It's like assuming a cake is just flour, sugar, and eggs sitting next to each other on the counter.
Rather than a chemical process that totally destroys the original ingredients.
Yes. It creates a completely new, irreversible substance. When you put people in a group, you aren't just adding them up, you are baking something entirely different.
And that new substance can be miraculous, or it can be incredibly toxic. The literature shows us that groups literally rewire how we perceive reality.
Which is wild.
It really is. The context of a group changes the risks we're willing to take, the attitudes we express, even our basic sensory processing. Groups make us capable of extreme, breathtaking intellectual breakthroughs that no single human could ever achieve in isolation.
But they also go the other way, right?
Oh, absolutely. They make us capable of horrifying darkness, the kind of bureaucratic atrocities, mob violence, and catastrophic corporate failures that absolutely require a group context to occur.
Which is exactly why you, the person listening to this right now, need to care about this. This isn't just some abstract academic theory.
Yeah, not at all.
Whether you are trying to survive the bizarre politics of your corporate office, or you're participating in a local town hall meeting, or just sitting on your couch trying to figure out how massive systemic failures happen in the news understanding group mechanics is your ultimate survival guide.
You spend your entire life moving from one group to another. Your family, your coworkers, your online communities.
Right.
And if you don't understand how those groups are quietly rewiring your brain, you're essentially flying blind. We had to dismantle the delusion of the individual to actually understand human behavior.
Okay, so where do we start?
Well, to do that, we need to look at how incredibly easily our individual perception can be hijacked. And we aren't just talking about a group convincing you to change your vote or, buy a different car. We are talking about a group overpowering your most basic fundamental senses.
Let's start with the simplest ingredient in this chemical reaction then. Peer pressure on your own eyeballs.
Yes.
Take me back to the 1950s. Solomon Asch. How did he prove that we can't even trust our own eyes when other people are in the room?
The Asch conformity experiments are foundational because of how brutally simple they are. Imagine it's 1951. You volunteer for a vision test at a university. You walk into this sterile laboratory room, and there are already, say, 6 or 7 other participants sitting around a table.
Okay, setting the scene.
You take the last empty seat. The researcher stands at the front of the room and places 2 cards on an easel. The first card has a single black line drawn on it. The second card has 3 comparison lines of different lengths, and they're labeled A, B, and C.
And your job is just to match them.
Exactly. Your task is to state out loud which of the 3 lines matches the target line.
And just to be clear for everyone listening, this isn't a trick question where the lines are only like a millimeter apart, right?
No. Completely unambiguous. If you have functional human vision, the answer is immediately, undeniably obvious. Let's say the correct answer is clearly line B.
Got it.
So the researcher goes around the table asking each person to state their answer out loud. The first person says line C. Yeah. Then the second person says line C. The third, fourth, fifth, and sixth people all confidently look at this incredibly obvious visual puzzle and say line C.
Oh, man. And now it's your turn, and your heart is probably just pounding out of your chest because you're looking at the card, and you know for a fact that it's line B.
But you are the only person who seems to think that.
Because, unbeknownst to you, the other people in the room are not actually participants.
Right, they are confederates, actors working for the researcher. They've been explicitly instructed to unanimously give the wrong answer on specific trials.
That is so devious.
It is.
Yeah.
The entire experiment is designed to isolate you and force a collision between your sensory reality and the social consensus.
Hold on, so are you telling me they didn't actually see the lines differently? They just lied so things wouldn't get awkward? Because, I mean, my instinct is to say I would never fall for that. I'd just say the right answer and assume the rest of the room needed glasses.
Most people assume they'd hold their ground. But the data tells a deeply uncomfortable story about human nature. Across these trials, roughly 75% of participants conformed to the group's incorrect answer at least once.
Wait, really? 75%.
75%.
That's insane.
Yeah.
75% of people will look at a black line on a white card, know it's shorter than another line, and look a researcher in the eye and just lie about it, just because 6 strangers did it first.
Exactly. And overall, if you look at all the responses across all the critical trials, about 37% of all answers given by the real participants conformed to the incorrect group consensus.
That is genuinely terrifying. But you mentioned they knew they were lying. It wasn't some kind of collective hallucination. How do we know they didn't just start second-guessing their own eyesight?
Because of a brilliant twist Ash introduced in later variations of the experiment. The setup is exactly the same. The actors all give the wrong answer out loud. But this time, the researcher tells the real participant that because they arrived late, or, because of a procedural change, they should write their answer down privately on a piece of paper instead of saying it out loud.
Oh, let me guess. The conformity just disappears.
It drops to practically 0.
Wow.
Yet when the social pressure is removed from the immediate public sphere, people suddenly trust their eyes again. This distinction is so vital, and it was actually formalized a few years later by psychologists Morton Deutsch and Harold Gerard.
What did they find?
They identified 2 entirely different mechanisms of conformity: informational influence and normative influence.
Okay, let's break those down, because there's a big difference between thinking you're wrong and knowing you're right but being too afraid to say it.
Absolutely. So informational influence occurs in genuinely ambiguous situations.
Yeah.
Imagine you're trying to guess how many jelly beans are in a massive glass jar. It's a difficult, ambiguous task.
Yeah, nobody really knows.
Right. You might internally guess 500. But if the 5 people before you all guess around 2,000, you will likely revise your guess upward. You conform because you genuinely believe the group possesses better information or a more accurate heuristic than you do. You're using the group as evidence about reality.
Which honestly is a totally rational survival mechanism. I mean, if you're out in the forest and your whole tribe suddenly starts running away from a bush, you don't stand there investigating the bush to see if there's a tiger.
You definitely do not.
You just assume they have information you don't, and you run. So that's informational influence.
Exactly. But Ash deliberately stripped all the ambiguity out of his experiment. The line lengths were not a jar of jelly beans. They were objective, easily verifiable facts. So Ash isolated normative influence in its purest form.
Normative influence.
Right. Normative influence is conformity driven exclusively by the desire to meet the positive expectations of another person or group. It is entirely about avoiding social disapproval, ostracism, or the sheer discomfort of being the odd one out.
So they're making a calculated trade-off. In a split second, their brain is basically doing the math. Is it more important to accurately report the length of this line, or is it more important to not look like a weirdo in front of these 6 guys I just met?
That's exactly it.
And 75% of the time, the brain decides that social harmony is way more valuable than objective truth.
It's a deeply ingrained evolutionary calculation.
Mm-hmm.
For early humans, being socially ostracized from the group meant literal death in the wilderness. We are wired to feel physical, psychological pain when we step out of line with our immediate peers.
So even in a basement laboratory,
Even in a low-stakes environment like a university basement in 1951, the threat of sticking out triggers that ancient alarm system.
that is wild when you think about it in the context of line lengths, because it's a completely harmless scenario, but it raises a massive flashing red warning light when we start to scale this up.
Oh, absolutely.
What happens when the people in the room aren't college students guessing line lengths, but highly educated experts? What happens when they make that exact same calculation trading truth for social harmony? But the stakes are like global war.
This is where we move from the quiet individual conformity of the Asch experiments into the structural catastrophic failure known as groupthink.
Right, the Oval Office scenario I mentioned at the very beginning of the show.
Exactly. The concept of groupthink was introduced in 1972 by Irving Janis. He was a research psychologist who was obsessed with this specific historical question. How do groups of highly intelligent, incredibly qualified individuals manage to make decisions that are so disastrously flawed?
He wasn't looking at college kids in labs.
No, he didn't look at laboratory experiments at all. He looked at real-world foreign policy disasters.
Like what?
He looked at the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion, where the Kennedy administration tried to overthrow Fidel Castro with a covert CIA operation that failed spectacularly within 24 hours. He looked at the escalation of the Vietnam War under Lyndon Johnson. He even looked at the failure of the military brass to anticipate the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, despite having ample intelligence warnings.
So he's looking at the absolute highest levels of power.
Right. Janis analyzed the historical records, the meeting notes, and the memoirs of the people in those rooms. And he found a recurring toxic pattern.
And that pattern is groupthink.
Yes, he defined groupthink as a mode of thinking that people engage in when they are deeply involved in a cohesive in-group. It happens when the members driving for unanimity overrides their motivation to realistically appraise alternative courses of action.
So it's basically the Asch experiment, but institutionalized. The drive for consensus actually suffocates reality.
It crushes the expression of dissent. It ignores the critical evaluation of evidence. And the terrifying result is that the decision produced by the group is collectively far worse than what any single individual in that room would have decided if they had just been given the data while sitting alone in their office.
The group actively degrades the intelligence of its members.
It really does.
Let's walk through what this actually looks like in a boardroom, because Janis identified 8 specific symptoms of groupthink, and they play out like a tragedy. It starts with an illusion of invulnerability.
Right. This is pervasive over-optimism.
Yeah.
In the Kennedy administration, there was this feeling of, we're the brightest minds in the world, we just won the election, we are backed by the U.S. military, how could we possibly fail?
Which is incredibly dangerous.
It is. This illusion encourages extreme risk-taking, because the group literally cannot conceive of a scenario where they lose.
And when someone does bring up a risk, the group engages in collective rationalization. They don't investigate the warning sign. They immediately invent reasons why a warning sign doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
If someone says, hey, Castro has a massive army, maybe 1,400 exiles won't be enough, the group immediately rationalizes it. Oh, the Cuban people will rise up and join them the minute they land.
They construct a shared narrative that protects their initial assumptions. And to protect themselves ethically, they develop an unshakable belief in the group's inherent morality.
See, this is the scariest symptom to me.
It is incredibly dangerous. If a cohesive group collectively decides that they are on the side of absolute good, that they are the heroes of the story, it short-circuits any ethical examination of the specific actions they're about to take.
Because if you're inherently good, then by definition, whatever you decide to do must be justified. You don't have to debate the morality of the invasion because you're the good guys.
Exactly. And naturally, if you are the good guys, everyone else is a cartoon villain.
Mm-hmm.
That leads to the symptom of stereotyped views of outgroups. The group starts characterizing the enemy, or even domestic critics, as too evil to negotiate with or too stupid to pose a real threat. They underestimate the complexity of the outside world because they've reduced everyone outside the room to a caricature.
Now, this is where the internal mechanics of the group get truly oppressive. Because once the group has this optimistic, morally justified, stereotyped plan, they exert immense direct pressure on any dissenters.
Right. It's not always a polite disagreement. If someone in the room raises a red flag, the rest of the group makes it abundantly, sometimes aggressively clear that disagreement is disloyal. They frame it as, why are you holding us back? Are you not a team player?
And that pressure leads directly to the next symptom, which is self-censorship. The individuals in the room might have profound doubts. They might see the glaring holes in the plan. But just like the participants in the Ash experiment, they swallow their objections.
They do.
They minimize their own doubts to themselves, and they stay silent to preserve their standing in the group.
And because everyone is terrified to speak up, the room falls quiet, which creates the illusion of unanimity. The leader looks around the room, sees nobody objecting, and assumes that silence means 100% agreement. Well, nobody is arguing, so we must have a perfect plan.
It's a house of cards built on everyone's individual fear of speaking first.
It really is. And the final symptom is perhaps the most fascinating structural element, the emergence of self-appointed mind guards.
Yes, this is the one that really stuck with me from the reading. A mind guard. What does that actually look like in practice?
A mind guard is a group member who basically takes it upon themselves to protect the leader or the group from information that would shatter the consensus. They act as an information filter.
Can you give an example?
Sure. For example, during the Bay of Pigs planning, Arthur Schlesinger, who was a historian and advisor to Kennedy, had severe private doubts about the invasion. But Robert Kennedy privately pulled Schlesinger aside at a party and essentially told him to stop pushing his objections. He said the president had made his mind up, and it was time to close ranks and support him.
Wow, that is a literal mind guard in action. Robert Kennedy wasn't protecting the president from an assassin. He was protecting the president from an uncomfortable fact.
Exactly.
He was protecting the consensus. It's like the group develops a social immune system, but instead of fighting off bad ideas or strategic flaws, it fights off reality to protect the health of the group's delusion.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. The group's primary goal shifts from finding the right answer to maintaining our cohesion. Now, Giannis didn't just list these symptoms. He was very specific about the structural conditions that create this perfect storm. Because groupthink doesn't happen every time 3 people order a pizza. It requires a specific environment.
Right. The recipe for the poison.
First, you need high group cohesion. The members must really value their membership in the group and want to be accepted by the others. If a group hates each other, they will gladly argue. So cohesion's the glue, but it's also the trap.
Makes sense.
Second, isolation from outside perspectives. The group must be insulated from qualified external critics who could punch holes in their logic.
Like being locked in a situation room for a week.
Exactly. Third, a directive leader who openly expresses a preferred conclusion early in the process. If the boss walks in and says, "I think we should do X, what do you guys think?" The possibility for objective debate is already dead.
Yeah, nobody wants to tell the boss they're wrong right out of the gate.
And finally, intense stress and time pressure. When the clock is ticking, the cognitive load is too high to engage in slow, deliberate critical thinking. The group defaults to whatever preserves harmony and produces a fast decision.
High cohesion, isolated environment, a boss who already knows what they want, and an impossible deadline. I mean, that doesn't just describe the Kennedy administration in 1961. That describes almost every corporate boardroom I've ever seen. It describes startup culture. It describes crisis PR teams.
It's extremely common. Now, to maintain intellectual rigor, we do have to acknowledge that the empirical status of groupthink as a formally defined overarching construct has been hotly debated in academic psychology for decades.
Wait, really? Because the symptoms seem so intuitively obvious. We've all seen this happen. Why is it debated?
The critique is largely methodological. First, Giannis's cognition is somewhat circular. He identified groupthink by looking for these bad symptoms, and then he blamed those symptoms on groupthink. Second, his reliance on historical case studies makes the theory heavily subject to hindsight bias. When we know an invasion failed catastrophically, it is very easy for a researcher to look back at the meeting notes and cherry-pick the moments of flawed decision-making.
Right, because if the Bay of Pigs had miraculously succeeded by pure luck, would we look at the same meeting notes and call it brilliant, cohesive teamwork?
Exactly. When you win, it's cohesion. When you lose, it's groupthink. Furthermore, when psychologists have tried to recreate the full, comprehensive model of groupthink in controlled laboratory experiments, the results have been mixed. It is very hard to ethically replicate the life or death stress of a presidential cabinet in a lab.
So do we throw the concept out? Are we saying groupthink isn't real?
Oh, not at all. While the neat 8-symptom package that Janice tied a bow on might be debated, the underlying component mechanisms are scientifically ironclad.
Okay.
The detrimental effects of a directive leader stating their preference first. Proven. The way extreme time pressure degrades alternative evaluation. Proven. The reality that high cohesion can prioritize harmony over accuracy. Absolutely proven. The label might be debated, but the mechanics of how a cohesive group drives itself off a cliff are very real.
Okay, so we've established how groups fail in quiet, isolated, cohesive boardrooms where everyone knows each other and everyone is trying to impress the boss. But let's completely pivot the environment.
Let's do it.
What happens at the absolute opposite extreme? Not a quiet room of 8 experts, but an anonymous, chaotic crowd of 8,000 strangers in the street.
This brings us to a phenomenon that has fascinated and terrified observers for centuries: the behavior of crowds. When we talk about mobs, riots, or mass panic, the primary psychological framework historically applied is called de-individuation.
The idea that you lose yourself in the crowd. And to trace this, we have to go back to late 19th century France, 1895. Gustave Le Bon publishes a massively influential book called The Crowd, a study of the popular mind.
Yes. Le Bon offered one of the first systematic theoretical accounts of crowd psychology. And his core thesis was that when an individual joins a crowd, they undergo a profound psychological transformation. He argued that the conscious personality basically vanishes.
Just disappears.
Right. The individual loses their sense of personal identity, their moral compass, and their capacity for rational thought.
He used some pretty aggressive language, too. He claimed that the individual regresses to a primitive, emotional, instinctual beast. They become highly suggestible, almost hypnotized by the collective will of the mob.
It is crucial to understand the historical context of Le Bon's work here. He was writing in an era still deeply scarred by the French Revolution and the subsequent social upheavals.
Right.
He was a conservative thinker who was genuinely terrified of the rising power of working-class crowds and organized labor. His theoretical framework was heavily biased by his political fear that the irrational masses would destroy social order.
So his methodology wasn't exactly a rigorous double-blind study. He was basically sitting in a Parisian cafe, watching a protest go by and writing, "Look at these mind-controlled animals."
Pretty much. His work was methodologically unsophisticated by modern standards. However, despite his heavy biases, he planted a flag on a very real phenomenon. People absolutely do act differently when they are submerged in a massive crowd. They engage in collective behaviors, vandalism, aggression, extreme emotional displays that they would never dream of doing while walking alone on a Tuesday morning.
So the observation was correct, but the mechanism required much more investigation.
Exactly. Which brings us into the modern era, specifically the 1960s and 70s, where psychologists tried to isolate exactly what triggers this loss of self. And a major figure here is Philip Zimbardo.
Right, Zimbardo.
Zimbardo focused on the concept of anonymity as the driver of de-individuation. He theorized that when you reduce the salience of a person's individual identity by making them anonymous, by immersing them in a large group, or by physically masking them, you reduce their sense of personal accountability.
And when accountability drops,
The internal restraints against aggressive or antisocial behavior dissolve.
we have to talk about his most famous demonstration of this, which is the 1971 Stanford prison experiment. It's one of the most famous and notorious events in psychological history.
It really is. The setup was designed to strip away individual identity and replace it with institutional roles. Zimbardo built a mock prison in the basement of the Stanford Psychology Building. He recruited college students, screened them for psychological normality, and randomly assigned them to play either guards or prisoners.
And he went to extreme lengths to enforce anonymity, right? The guards wore identical khaki uniforms, they carried billy clubs, and they wore mirrored sunglasses so you couldn't see their eyes. And the prisoners were stripped, deloused, given smocks with ID numbers instead of names, and made to wear nylon caps to simulate shaved heads. He essentially erased their civilian identities.
Completely. The experiment was originally scheduled to last 2 weeks, but it had to be shut down after just 6 days.
Because it got so bad.
The behavioral escalation was shocking. The participants assigned as guards rapidly internalized their roles. They began exhibiting genuinely sadistic behavior, subjecting the prisoners to psychological torture, sleep deprivation, and humiliation. The prisoners, in turn, began exhibiting severe emotional breakdowns, passive-aggressive rebellion, and eventually learned helplessness.
The speed of it is what always blows my mind. In less than a week, normal, healthy college kids turned into brutal authoritarians and broken inmates just because of the uniforms and the environment.
Now, similar to groupthink, we must critically evaluate the Stanford prison experiment. In recent years, it has faced immense methodological scrutiny. Critics have pointed out that Zimbardo himself actively coached the guards on how to be oppressive, acting as a directive warden. There is evidence of demand characteristics where participants acted the way they thought the researchers wanted them to act.
So it wasn't a pure, organic descent into madness. The researchers had their thumbs heavily on the scale.
Exactly. But even with those severe flaws, the conceptual legacy of the study remains culturally massive. It vividly illustrates how institutional contexts, the assignment of power, and the stripping of individual identity can facilitate abusive behavior. The traditional interpretation was that anonymity unlocks the primal beast inside us.
But this is where the plot of our deep dive takes a massive twist, because modern psychology looked at Le Bon, looked at Zimbardo, and said, you are both misinterpreting what is actually happening in the human brain when we enter a crowd. We aren't losing our minds at all.
We really aren't. This paradigm shift is driven by the social identity model of de-individuation effects, commonly referred to as the SIDE model.
The SIDE model?
Spearheaded by researchers like Stephen Reicher, this model completely flips a script on what a crowd does to a person.
This is one of those aha moments that just changes how you see the world. Break down the SIDE model for us.
Well, Le Bon and Zimbardo argued that immersion in a crowd erases your identity and erases social norms, leaving behind an irrational, unrestrained actor. The SIDE model argues the exact opposite. Crowds do not erase identity, they simply shift it. Crowds do not erase norms, they change which norms apply.
So I'm not becoming a mindless zombie, I'm just changing my psychological uniform.
Precisely. When you are alone, your salient identity is your personal identity, your unique quirks, values, and history. But when you join a crowd, your salient identity shifts from the personal level to the social level. You stop thinking of yourself primarily as John Smith, the accountant, and you start thinking of yourself as us, the protesters, or us, the fans.
And here is the crucial mechanism. Once you adopt that social identity, you look around to see what the norms of that specific identity are, and you conform to them. You are acting completely rationally based on the rules of the group you just merged with.
Let's use a clear example. Imagine a group of individuals standing together in a public square. If the contextual cues prime their identity as combative, hardcore football fans, they will look to the norms of that identity. They might become aggressive, chant profanities, and vandalize property. Not because they lost their minds, but because they are faithfully executing the norms of the hooligan identity.
But if you take those exact same biological humans standing in the exact same physical square, but a local tragedy has just occurred, and the contextual cues prime their identity as grieving community members, what happens?
They will behave completely differently. They will stand in quiet solidarity, comfort strangers, and donate money to charity. They're still anonymous. They are still immersed in a large crowd. But because the salient social identity changed, the normative behavior completely flipped.
That is incredibly empowering. It means a crowd isn't just a ticking time bomb of violence. A crowd is highly structured, context-dependent, and perfectly capable of immense pro-social behavior as long as the identity they're adopting calls for it.
It restores agency to collective behavior. Riots are not random explosions of madness. They usually have specific targets that make sense within the grievance of the group's social identity. The SIDE model proves we don't lose ourselves in a crowd. We find a new, collective version of ourselves.
Okay, so if crowds make us hyper-attuned to acting out our group identity and we are so responsive to the people around us, I have to ask a dark question.
Okay.
Why do people in large crowds routinely ignore dying people on the street? Shouldn't New Yorker or human being be an identity that helps someone in trouble? Why does being in a group sometimes completely paralyze our morality?
That contradiction is the gateway to one of the most tragic and practically important findings in all of social psychology, the bystander effect. We've seen how groups can spark intense, aggressive action. Now we must look at how groups guarantee devastating inaction.
And we have to start with the story that horrified a nation and launched this entire field of study, the 1964 murder of Kitty Genovese in Queens, New York.
The initial narrative that was published in the New York Times was chilling. It claimed that Kitty Genovese was brutally attacked and murdered outside her apartment building, and that 38 of her neighbors watched the attack unfold from their windows over the course of half an hour.
38 people.
And the report stated that not a single one of those 38 witnesses intervened, and not a single one even bothered to call the police.
It was held up as the ultimate proof of open decay, apathy, and the coldness of modern society.
Now, for the sake of historical accuracy, we must clarify that decades of subsequent investigation have revealed that original narrative was heavily exaggerated by the press.
Right, it wasn't quite as cut and dry.
It was a complex, sprawling crime scene in the middle of the night. There were not 38 people who had a clear view of the entire murder. Some people heard shouts but thought it was a drunken lover's quarrel. A few people actually did yell out their windows to scare the attacker away initially, and police records show that some calls were eventually made.
So the 38 silent witnesses was a bit of a journalistic myth, but, and this is the crucial part, that myth horrified two specific psychologists, John Darley and Bib Latané. They read that article and thought, is society actually just evil, or is there a psychological mechanism at play when people are in a group?
Darley and Latané hypothesized that the neighbors didn't fail to help despite there being 38 of them. They failed to help because there were 38 of them.
Counterintuitive, but wow.
They set up a series of ingenious experiments in 1968 to test this. And they discovered that the bystander effect is a robustly, undeniably real phenomenon. The probability of any single individual stepping in to help in an emergency systematically decreases as the number of bystanders increases.
The more people who see you collapse, the less likely you are to get help from any specific one of them. How does the brain justify that?
The researchers identified two distinct cognitive mechanisms that cause this paralysis. The first is called pluralistic ignorance.
Walk us through how this works, because I think everyone has felt this at some point.
Pluralistic ignorance occurs when an event is ambiguous. Emergencies rarely happen with a flashing neon sign that says, "This is an emergency." Imagine you were sitting in a waiting room, and you hear a loud crash and a scream from the office next door. Did a bookshelf fall on someone, or are the movers just being clumsy? You aren't sure.
So what do? You look around at the other people in the waiting room to see how they are reacting. You're looking for informational influence to define reality.
Exactly. But here's the trap. Everyone else in the room is doing the exact same thing. They're all looking around to gauge the situation. Now, social norms dictate that we don't want to look panicked or foolish in public. We want to appear calm and collected. So everyone is internally anxious, but externally projecting a completely blank, calm face.
It's like a massive, silent game of poker. Everyone is bluffing. You look at the guy across from you, and he looks totally calm. He looks at you, and you look totally calm.
And because everyone sees a room full of calm people, they all simultaneously conclude, since nobody else is reacting, my initial fear must be wrong. This must not be an emergency.
They literally trick each other into doing nothing.
Yeah.
Latané and Darley proved this with the famous smoke-filled room experiment,
Yes.
right?
They had participants fill out a questionnaire in a small room. Suddenly, thick white smoke started pouring into the room through a wall vent. When participants were alone, they invariably got up, investigated the smoke, and left the room to report it within a couple of minutes.
Because there's no one to look at, so you trust your own alarm system.
But when a participant was placed in the room with two Confederate actors who were instructed to notice the smoke, shrug, and just keep filling out their questionnaires, the results were terrifying.
What happened?
The real participants would sit in the room, coughing, waving smoke away from their faces, and doing nothing for the entire 6-minute duration of the experiment. Pluralistic ignorance overpowered their basic survival instinct to flee a fire.
Unbelievable. So that's the first mechanism. We convince each other it's not an emergency. But what if it's obvious? What if someone literally grabs their chest and collapses on the sidewalk in broad daylight? There's no ambiguity. Pluralistic ignorance shouldn't apply. Why do crowds still walk past them?
That brings us to the second mechanism, the diffusion of responsibility.
Yeah.
This is the reduction in each individual's felt obligation to intervene, simply because the psychological burden is shared among multiple people.
It's the math of guilt.
It is exactly that. If you are walking alone in the woods and someone collapses in front of you, 100% of the responsibility to save their life rests on your shoulders. If you walk away, the guilt is entirely yours. But if you're walking through Times Square and someone collapses and there are 100 other people watching, your slice of the responsibility pie is now 1%.
and it becomes incredibly easy to rationalize not acting. You tell yourself, I'm not a doctor, I'd probably just get in the way. That woman over there in the scrubs is probably a nurse, she'll handle it. Someone in this crowd has definitely already called 911, I have to get to my meeting.
And because every single person in the crowd is simultaneously making that exact same rationalization, nobody steps forward.
This research is so vital because it saves lives. I was taught the practical application of this in a basic CPR class. They drill it into your head. If someone collapses, you never, ever just yell to the crowd, someone call an ambulance.
Because the word someone triggers the diffusion of responsibility perfectly. Everyone assumes the anonymous someone is the guy standing next to them.
Exactly. The instructor taught us that you have to point directly at a specific person, you make eye contact, point your finger and say, you, sir, in the blue jacket, call an ambulance right now.
By doing that, you shatter the diffusion of responsibility. You take the entire psychological burden of the emergency and concentrate it squarely on the shoulders of the man in the blue jacket. You force him out of the anonymous crowd and assign him an individual, highly identifiable role. And once isolated, people almost always comply and help.
You in the blue jacket. It's a mental tool everyone should carry with them. Now, let's take this concept, this diffusion of responsibility, and look at it in a context that isn't life or death, but is incredibly frustrating and universally relatable, because this exact same psychological mechanism quietly drains human productivity every single day.
We are moving from the bystander effect to its mundane corporate cousin, social loafing.
I am talking about group projects. The bane of every high school student and middle manager's existence. Why is it that when you assign a project to a team of 5 people, it feels like 2 people do 90% of the work and the other 3 just vanish into the ether? Are humans just naturally lazy?
To answer that, we have to look at one of the earliest experiments in social psychology, conducted by a French agricultural engineer named Max Ringelmann in 1913. Ringelmann was interested in agricultural efficiency, specifically how men, animals, and machines pull loads. He set up a very simple experiment measuring how hard individuals pulled on a rope.
A literal tug of war.
Yes. He measured the pulling force of a single man. Then he had groups of 2, 3, and 8 men pull the same rope, and he measured the total force. The mathematical expectation is straightforward. If one man can pull 100 units of force, 8 men should pull 800 units of force.
But that's not what happened.
Not at all. Ringelmann found an inverse relationship between the size of the group and the magnitude of individual effort. In a group of 8, the total force was nowhere near 8 times the individual force. In fact, each individual was only pulling at about half of their maximum capacity. They were slacking off.
Now, to be fair to the rope pullers, my first thought is that maybe they just aren't coordinated. I mean, if I pull a second before you pull, our energy cancels out. It's hard to synchronize 8 guys on a rope.
That was the initial counter-argument. Researchers wondered if the Ringelmann effect was just a coordination loss, not a motivational loss. It took decades before psychologists Bibb Latané, Kipling Williams, and Stephen Harkins designed follow-up experiments to separate those 2 variables.
How do you test for effort without coordination getting in the way?
They moved from pulling ropes to making noise. They put participants in a room, gave them headphones playing deafening white noise, and blindfolded them. They told them to shout or clap as loudly as they possibly could.
So you can't hear or see anyone else.
Right. Sometimes the participants were told they were shouting alone. Other times they were told they were shouting together with a group of other people in the room. In reality, they were always shouting alone. The researchers were just manipulating their belief about the group context.
Oh, that is clever. So there is 0 physical coordination required. If the volume drops when they think they're in a group, it is pure laziness.
And the volume dropped significantly. The researchers proved that social loafing is a genuine, pervasive motivational deficit. People exert less effort to achieve a goal when they work in a group than when they work alone.
It makes me think of singing in a choir versus singing a solo on stage.
Yeah.
If you are standing alone under a spotlight singing a solo, you are giving 110% effort because every single note, good or bad, is attributed directly to you.
Exactly.
But if you are in a choir of 100 people and you have a slightly sore throat, you just lip sync the high notes, you dial your effort back to 20% because your voice is blended into the collective sound. Nobody knows that you specifically are slacking.
That choir analogy is perfect because it identifies the exact mechanism, a lack of individual identifiability. Social loafing is driven by the diffusion of responsibility. When your individual output is pooled into a single group product, like a single rope being pulled, a single collective shout, or a single slide deck for a team presentation, the contingency between your personal effort and your personal evaluation is broken.
You can hide in the crowd.
Precisely. If the boss only sees the final presentation and can't tell who wrote which slide, the motivation to excel is severely diluted for the members who aren't intrinsically motivated.
Okay, so if I'm a manager listening to this and I have a team that is chronically underperforming because of social loafing, how do I fix it? How do I get them to pull the rope as hard as they can?
The psychological literature provides a very clear roadmap for curing social loafing. The primary antidote is what you just described with the solo singer. You must increase individual identifiability.
You have to make sure everyone knows exactly who is singing what note.
Yes. You structure the group task so that individual contributions are visible, measurable, and subject to distinct evaluation. You don't just assign a team project, you assign specific, unique deliverables to each person. Second, you increase task involvement. The work itself must be meaningful. People loaf less when they believe the task is highly important, challenging, or unique to their specific skill set.
Because if they feel like they are just a cog in a machine doing busy work, they will slack. If they feel like their specific expertise is vital to the survival of the project, they pull harder.
And finally, interpersonal accountability. When group members are made accountable to each other through peer reviews, clear communication of expectations, or small group sizes where everyone knows each other well, the social pressure works in favor of productivity rather than providing a place to hide.
So we've spent the last 40 minutes looking at the dark side of the moon. We have thoroughly dragged groups through the mud. We've seen how they force us to conform to lies, how cohesion breeds disastrous groupthink, how crowds shift our moral compass, how bystanders let people die, and how teams make us lazy. It sounds like joining a group is the absolute worst thing a human being can do.
It certainly paints a bleak picture of our social architecture.
But this is a deep dive, and we promised the full picture, so I want to completely flip the script. Because there is a massive body of evidence showing that under the right conditions, groups aren't a disaster. They are actual magic. They can reliably outperform even the most brilliant individuals. Let's talk about collective intelligence.
To understand the magic, we have to look at the statistical beauty of crowds. And the most famous origin story for this concept takes Francis Galton.
Galton is a fascinating, heavily flawed character. He was Charles Darwin's cousin, he was a pioneering statistician, and he was also a prominent eugenicist. He possessed a deeply elitist view of humanity. He genuinely believed that the average commoner was intellectually useless and that society should only be guided by experts.
Which is what makes his discovery at this country fair so delightfully ironic. Galton observed a contest where visitors could pay a sixpence to guess the dressed weight of a prize ox.
So they have to look at this massive living cow and guess how much meat it will yield after being butchered.
Exactly. And this contest attracted everyone. There were butchers and farmers, the absolute domain experts who handled livestock every day. And there was a massive crowd of clerks, shoemakers, and completely uneducated commoners who had no idea what they were looking at. Galton collected all 787 tickets after the contest was over.
Because he wanted to prove them wrong.
Right. He wanted to analyze the data to prove his thesis that the democratic average of a crowd's guess would be absurdly wrong and that the experts would be vastly superior.
So he takes all the guesses, he lines them up, and he calculates the median guess of the crowd.
The median guess of the entire crowd of 787 people was 11,197 pounds. The actual dressed weight of the ox was 1,198 pounds.
The crowd missed the exact weight by 1 single pound.
So the collective guess of the crowd was not only more accurate than the vast majority of individual guesses, it was more accurate than the estimates provided by the cattle experts themselves. Galton was stunned. He published his findings in the journal Nature, inadvertently laying the foundation for what journalist James Surowiecki would later popularize in 2004 as the wisdom of crowds.
It's a beautiful mathematical truth. But we have to be very careful here because we just spent an hour proving that crowds were often incredibly stupid. You can't just throw 800 random people in a room and expect them to solve quantum physics. There are strict rules to this magic trick, right?
Very strict rules. Surowiecki outlined 4 necessary conditions that must be present for a crowd to be intelligent. If any of these are missing, the wisdom collapses into mob irrationality.
Let's go through the checklist. What is rule number 1?
Diversity of opinion. Each person in the crowd must possess some private information, a different heuristic, or a distinct perspective. If you ask 800 people who have all only read the exact same pamphlet, they aren't adding any new data to the equation. Diversity of thought ensures a wide spread of data points.
Okay, rule number 2.
Independence. And this is the most critical one based on everything we've discussed today. People's individual judgments cannot be influenced by the people around them.
No informational influence, no normative pressure, no Ash experiment dynamics.
Exactly. In Galton's contest, people wrote their guesses on private tickets and dropped them in a box. They didn't stand in a circle and debate the weight of the ox. If they had talked to each other, the loud, confident experts would have swayed the commoners, pluralistic ignorance would have set in, and the crowd's guess would have been corrupted by social dynamics. Independence preserves the pure signal of what each person actually thinks.
Okay, rule 3.
Decentralization. People need to be able to draw on their own specialized local knowledge rather than being directed by a central authority. And finally, rule 4. An appropriate aggregation mechanism.
Meaning you need a way to actually calculate the answer. You can't just have 800 people shouting numbers. You need a system like Galton finding the median or a stock market aggregating prices to turn those private judgments into a collective decision.
When you have all 4 of those conditions, the statistical magic happens. Why? Because every individual guess contains 2 things, a tiny piece of the truth and a bunch of random error. When you aggregate them independently, the random errors, some guessing too high, some guessing too low, cancel each other out completely. And what is left behind is the pure signal of truth.
It's brilliant, but that is an estimation task. Guessing a weight, guessing jelly beans, guessing a stock price. But what about when a group needs to actually do something? What if they aren't just dropping tickets in a box, but they have to design a software program or negotiate a treaty or write a podcast script? They have to interact.
That brings us to the cutting edge of this research. In 2010, an organizational psychologist named Anita Williams-Woolley published a landmark study in the journal Science that revolutionized how we view interactive teams. She wasn't looking for the wisdom of crowds. She was looking for collective intelligence.
I remember reading this and having my assumptions completely shattered.
In individual psychology, we have this well-established concept of general intelligence, often called the G factor. It means that if an individual performs very well on a math test, they will likely perform above average on a verbal test or a spatial reasoning test. It's a general cognitive ability.
Right.
Woolley wanted to know, do groups have a similar general intelligence? Is there a C factor, a collective intelligence factor, that predicts how well a specific group will perform across a wide variety of different interactive tasks?
So she puts groups of people together, gives them puzzles to solve, negotiations to run, moral dilemmas to debate, and sees if some groups are just universally better at everything.
Yes. And she found that the C factor absolutely exists. Some groups are just reliably, fundamentally smarter than others, regardless of the task.
Okay, so if I am a CEO and I want to build a tiger team with a massive C factor to solve my company's biggest problem, my immediate instinct is to look at the resumes and just pick the 5 people with the highest individual IQs. Put 5 absolute geniuses in a room and you get a genius group.
Right. That is the incredibly intuitive assumption that almost every corporation makes. And Woolley's data proved it completely wrong.
I love this part.
She found that the collective intelligence of the group was not strongly correlated with the average IQ of the group members. And it was not correlated with the highest individual IQ in the room. You can put 5 geniuses in a room, and they might perform terribly as a group.
Then what on earth makes a group smart? If it isn't brain power, what is the secret ingredient?
Woolley found 3 primary factors that heavily predicted a group's collective intelligence. Number 1, social sensitivity. This is the group member's ability to accurately read the emotions, complex mental states, and nonverbal cues of the other people in the room. They measured this using the reading the mind in the eyes test, where people try to identify emotions just from pictures of eyes. Groups with high social sensitivity were vastly smarter.
They could read the room.
Exactly. Number 2, equitable conversational turn-taking.
Meaning everyone gets to speak.
Not just gets to speak, but the participation is evenly distributed. In groups with low collective intelligence, 1 or 2 dominant personalities hijack the conversation. Even if those dominant people were smart, the group's overall performance tanked. In groups with high collective intelligence, the conversational floor was shared dynamically. When a specific subtask required someone's expertise, they spoke up, and then they yielded the floor.
Goodbye, directive leader from the groupthink era. You can't have a dictator if you want collective intelligence.
Precisely. And the third predictor, which generated a lot of headlines, was the proportion of women in the group.
Let's unpack that. Is that a biological imperative, or is it tied back to the first point?
It is deeply tied to the first point. The research indicates that it is not about gender inherently, but about the fact that women, on average, systematically score higher on measures of social sensitivity than men do. Therefore, statistically, adding more women to a group tends to elevate the group's overall capacity to read nonverbal cues and moderate equitable turn-taking, which in turn spikes the C factor.
That is fascinating. The core finding is that when humans have to solve complex interactive problems, intelligence is not primarily cognitive. It is primarily social.
Exactly. It's about how the nodes in the network connect, not just the processing power of the individual node.
Okay, but hold on. I need to push back on this because I am spotting an immense glaring contradiction between Galton's ox and Woolley's C factor.
Let's hear it.
For Galton's ox, the wisdom of the crowd, the absolute non-negotiable secret ingredient was strict independence. People could not talk to each other. They had to be totally isolated in their judgments, or the magic failed.
Right.
But for Woolley's C factor, the secret ingredient is all about highly attuned social sensitivity and equitable turn-taking. That requires intense, constant interaction and communication. How can the rule for group genius simultaneously be never talk to each other and constantly read each other's emotions? Are there two entirely different flavors of group genius?
That is a phenomenal observation, and it cuts to the very heart of why group dynamics are so complex. You are right, there is a tension there. But it resolves when you look at the nature of the task.
The task dictates the rules.
Exactly. Galton's ox was an estimation task. It was about discovering a pre-existing static truth, a number. In estimation tasks, human interaction only introduces bias. It introduces normative pressure, anchoring effects, and informational cascading. If you want a group to guess a number, independence is the only way to protect the data.
But Woolley's groups weren't guessing numbers.
They were engaged in generative, highly interdependent problem solving. They had to negotiate, create, and adapt. You cannot write a software program by having 100 developers independently write code in a vacuum and then averaging their keystrokes. Generative tasks require the synthesis of different skills. You must interact.
And because you must interact, you expose yourself to all the dangers we talked about in the first half of the show. Groupthink, conformity, loafing.
Bingo. And that is why social sensitivity and turn-taking are the magic keys. High social sensitivity is the psychological immune system that protects an interacting group from groupthink. If someone in the room is feeling doubtful but afraid to speak up, like in the Bay of Pigs, a socially sensitive team member will read their body language, notice their hesitation, and proactively invite them to share their dissenting view.
They actively dismantle the self-censorship.
Yes, and equitable turn-taking prevents the directive leader from enforcing an illusion of unanimity. Woolley's conditions are essentially the structural antidotes to Janice's groupthink.
That makes so much sense. If you want a crowd to guess the weight of an ox, tell them to shut up. If you want a team to solve a complex crisis, teach them how to fiercely, equitably listen to each other. It all depends on the structure.
It does. And this brings us to a final underlying layer of this whole discussion. We've uncovered how bizarre, contradictory, and powerful group psychology is. But there is an invisible force that shapes how we perceive all of this, before we even look at the science.
And that force is the actual language we speak.
Specifically the English language, and how its vocabulary secretly codes our perception of collective behavior.
English is incredibly rich in organizational terminology. We make very subtle, specific distinctions in the professional world. A group is just any set of people with a shared characteristic. A team implies interdependence toward a shared goal. A crowd is a temporary physical aggregation.
And we have developed a vast, vital currency of idioms to navigate boardroom dynamics. Terms like playing devil's advocate, organizing a brainstorming session, avoiding an echo chamber, or engaging in consensus building. These aren't just buzzwords, they are linguistic tools we use to diagnose the health of a group's interaction.
But when we step out of the boardroom and look at the streets, the vocabulary radically changes, and it carries a heavy, heavy bias.
It does. We need critical literacy when parsing how English discourse handles crowds, because crowds are overwhelmingly described with a heavy, negative, evaluative charge.
Think about the phrases we use on autopilot. Mob mentality, herd behavior, mob rule, pack mentality. We use animalistic terms. Herd, pack.
We treat the word crowd itself as a symptom of a psychological disease. And this linguistic bias traces its roots directly back to Gustave Le Bon in 1895. His political panic about working-class revolutions losing their rationality got baked into the academic literature, and from there, it seeped into our everyday idioms.
His 130-year-old political fear is still dictating how a news anchor describes a protest today.
Exactly. By automatically framing collective behavior as a regression into irrationality, calling it herd behavior, the language systematically blindfolds us to the moments when crowds actually exhibit the behavior Raker described in the side model. It blinds us to collective protection, deliberative capacity, or social solidarity.
Because if a group of people is doing something we inherently fear or disagree with, we strip them of their agency. We call them a mob, infected by mob mentality. But when we want to describe positive collective phenomena, when people gather to do something we approve of, we suddenly use entirely different, elevated vocabulary.
We shift to terms like collective action, social movement, community organizing, or civic engagement.
A mob riots. A community organizes. But physically, psychologically, it might be the exact same mechanisms of group identity at play. Being alert to how vocabulary frames the phenomenon is crucial. The language itself tries to trick you into categorizing group behavior too simply.
It is the final layer of the delusion. If you aren't careful, the words you use will dictate your understanding of human nature.
Okay, let's take a deep breath and synthesize this massive journey we've been on.
We've covered a century of human nature.
We started by challenging the grand delusion of the individual, this comforting fiction that you are always just a static, unchanging you, regardless of who is standing next to you.
We saw how the invisible normative pressure of a room can make you deny what your own eyes see, just to fit in. We saw how the desire for cohesion and the fear of a directive leader can create the intellectual black hole of groupthink, leading experts to disastrous historical failures.
We watched the individual self vanish into a crowd, only to realize it didn't vanish at all. It just shifted its uniform to match a new social identity, capable of violence or charity depending on the context. We felt the tragic, silent paralysis of pluralistic ignorance and the diffusion of responsibility that lets bystanders walk past a crisis and lets coworkers slack off on a project.
But we also saw the miraculous redemptive potential of groups, the statistical perfection of an independent crowd guessing a truth, and the profound collective intelligence that emerges when a team practices genuine social sensitivity and equitable turn-taking.
The ultimate takeaway here is that groups are not inherently good, and they are not inherently evil. They aren't magic, and they aren't monsters. They are simply powerful, relentless multipliers. And the outcome, whether you get a historic breakthrough or a catastrophic disaster, depends entirely on the structural conditions you build, the norms you allow, and the language you use to define them.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering, and frankly provocative thought to consider long after this deep dive ends.
Lay it on us.
We've established today that being in a group fundamentally alters your psychology, your risk tolerance, your ethics, and your capabilities. But think about your daily existence. You spend your entire life moving seamlessly from one group to another. You are influenced by your family at breakfast, you adopt the norms of your team at work in the afternoon, and you immerse yourself in the tribal identities of your digital communities at night.
You were never really alone.
Exactly. So it forces a strange, almost existential question. If your behavior is constantly being overwritten by the groups you inhabit, is there really a permanent, independent, fundamental you underneath it all? Or is the individual identity that you value so fiercely just a constantly shifting reflection of whatever group you happen to be standing in today?
Are you the flour and the sugar, maintaining your own properties? Or are you just the chemical reaction of the room? Are you writing your own story, or are you just whatever cake the world decided to bake today? It's a lot to think about. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Go analyze the groups in your life, and we will catch you next time.